The rain stopped, but the sky remained a bruised, heavy purple. WYRMSCALE stood at the bus stop, checking her watch against the digital display of the nearby kiosk. The glass panel behind the bench, which usually advertised a local bank, was obscured by something else today. It was not a poster, but a wall of salt-heavy, translucent water, suspended perfectly vertical and motionless. Thousands of tiny, silver-scaled fish darted within the liquid glass, their gills pulsing rhythmically against the impossible barrier of the air. The water did not spill. It held its shape with the precision of a masterwork, a vast, vertical ocean rising miles into the cloud layer. WYRMSCALE reached out a finger, pressing against the boundary where the pavement met the blue-green D. There was no coldness, only a faint, rhythmic humming that vibrated through the soles of her boots. A school of minnows swirled in a tight, frantic circle just inches from her skin, their eyes tiny, unblinking mirrors reflecting her own steady gaze. A yellow city bus rounded the corner, its engine whining in the unnatural silence that had descended upon the street. The driver didn't see the wall until the vehicle was mere yards away. The bus screeched to a halt, the smell of burnt rubber mingling with the sharp, ozone-heavy scent of the ocean. The front bumper dipped, nudging the base of the water column. The wall rippled, a shockwave of bioluminescent sparks shivering through the liquid, sending the fish scattering into the impenetrable dark of the upper heights. The bus driver opened the doors, his face drained of color as he stared at the shifting mass of water. Passengers began to spill out, their confused voices rising in a discordant chorus of alarm. WYRMSCALE remained seated on the bench, watching as the pressure within the water began to increase. A deep, tectonic groan echoed from the center of the wall, and a hairline fracture of dry air appeared within the fluid, widening until it exposed a glimpse of a different, submerged world beyond. WYRMSCALE stood, smoothing the creases in her coat with slow, deliberate motions. She ignored the panicked throngs of people scattering toward the subway entrance, their footsteps heavy and irregular on the cracked concrete. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, metallic device, its surface etched with lines that mirrored the patterns she had observed in the water. Her movements were fluid, devoid of the frantic energy that gripped the others, her breathing steady as she calibrated the device to the frequency of the hum. She watched a stray umbrella tumble into the base of the wall. It did not float or sink, but became suspended in the middle of the fluid, held firm by the immense pressure of the column. WYRMSCALE adjusted her scarf, checking the device once more to ensure the containment field was holding steady. She took a sip of water from a plastic bottle, her eyes scanning the horizon where the skyline was beginning to blur into the same impossible, aquatic hue as the wall behind the bus stop. The city lights flickered and died, leaving the street illuminated only by the faint, shimmering glow emanating from the water. WYRMSCALE noted the way the shadow of the wall stretched across the plaza, lengthening as the sun dipped behind the rising tide. She traced the architecture of the surrounding buildings, calculating the structural integrity of the foundations against the growing weight of the phenomenon. The hum was becoming a roar, a low-frequency pulse that synchronized with the beating of her own heart. She knelt by the curb and pried up a loose piece of asphalt, revealing a hidden compartment she had sealed there weeks ago. Inside lay a set of heavy, lead-lined cables and an array of magnetic anchors, all pre-drilled and waiting for this specific alignment. WYRMSCALE began to unspool the heavy wire, her fingers working with the practiced ease of a technician who had anticipated this exact pressure point long before the first ripple had disturbed the tranquility of the afternoon commute. The blueprints were etched into her memory, a silent architecture of intent she had mapped out during the dormant months. 3 years ago, she had stood in this exact parking lot while the local authorities debated the zoning for the tower that now pierced the low-hanging clouds above. WYRMSCALE had not been there to protest the height or the obstruction. She had been measuring the seismic resonance of the bedrock, calculating the precise point where the structural steel would eventually fatigue under the pressure of the coming rupture. It became clear now that the tower was never meant to be a permanent fixture of the skyline. As the concrete parking lot began to buckle beneath her boots, WYRMSCALE traced the path of the conduit she had secretly installed during the building's initial foundation pour. The cables weren't designed to support the structure, but to bleed its internal energy into the earth, preventing a total collapse that would have otherwise leveled the city blocks. She had been preparing for this displacement long before the clouds turned gray. The roar intensified, vibrating through the soles of her shoes as the tower groaned in rhythmic, metallic pulses. People were streaming out of the nearby offices, their faces masks of confusion as the asphalt liquefied into a viscous, shifting tide. WYRMSCALE tightened the final anchor, her movements precise despite the chaotic descent of debris from the heights above. Every second she spent tethering the structure to the grounding rod was a second stolen from the inevitable, yet the stakes had expanded beyond her immediate safety. Time was no longer measured in minutes, but in the rapid, stuttering descent of the cloud layer that threatened to swallow the parking lot whole. The air grew thin, smelling of ozone and ancient, stagnant salt. WYRMSCALE ignored the panicked shouting of the commuters, focusing entirely on the tension gauges wired into the bulkhead. If she failed to bypass the primary circuit within the next rotation of the hum, the entire structural integrity of the district would shatter, erasing the last barrier between the submerged world and the surface. A shadow detached itself from the lobby of the tower, moving with a predatory grace that suggested more than mere human panic. These were the observers, the ones who had funded the original Foundation project with a cold, singular purpose. They didn't want the tower to hold, they wanted to see if the anchor she had installed would actually anchor the rift. WYRMSCALE stood her ground, the heavy wrench in her hand serving as both a tool of repair and a final line of defense. She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out a jagged shard of obsidian-like glass, a piece of the wall she had recovered during her initial surveillance. It was heady, pulsing with the faint, rhythmic light that matched the frequency of the tower. This was the material proof she had needed. The substance of the rupture was not merely a physical phenomenon, but an organized, synthetic intrusion. She clutched the evidence firmly, knowing that this single, tangible fragment would hold the truth of the world's quiet displacement. Holding the shard against the base of the tower, she watched as the metal groaned and accepted the resonance, the surface of the steel softening to mirror the glass. The verification was complete. The tower was acting as a bridge, a siphon designed to draw the liquid environment into the city's heart. By introducing the shard into the circuit, she had effectively hardwired the collapse to her own specifications. The tower was no longer a threat to the city, but a controlled valve for the encroaching sea. She looked toward the parking lot entrance and saw them watching, their presence confirming that she was not the only one who understood the mechanics of the shift. They knew, and they were waiting for her to finish the connection. The knowledge was a weight, a shared burden that spanned far beyond the parking lot. WYRMSCALE secured the final connection, her eyes fixed on a horizon, knowing that the secret was out and the true scale of the intrusion had only just begun to reveal itself. The asphalt beneath the bus stop shivered with a rhythmic, unnatural heat. Behind the glass pane, the world had ceased to be a simple suburban sprawl. A wall of water, towering and translucent, pressed against the horizon like a held breath. WYRMSCALE stood before the figures emerging from the mist. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, their presence displacing the air itself. She adjusted her grip on the wrench, not as a weapon, but as a pendulum measuring the sudden, quiet collapse of normalcy. She extended her hand, revealing the fragment she had salvaged from the tower. It was a jagged piece of iridescent material that hummed in sympathy with the encroaching tide. The figures stopped, their forms flickering between solid matter and shifting currents. They did not speak, but the vibration in the ground intensified, a low-frequency acknowledgement of the truth she carried. By holding the object aloft, WYRMSCALE forced them to witness the fragility of the boundary they were so effortlessly dismantling with their very existence. The pressure in the air shifted as they reacted. They attempted to recalibrate the atmospheric density, trying to fold the space around the bus stop to conceal the liquid wall behind it. WYRMSCALE recognized the pattern of their interference, a desperate act of maintenance against the entropy she had triggered. She leaned into the grounding rod, channeling the latent energy of the circuit back into the earth. It was a counter-resonance, a refusal to let them redefine the physics of the immediate, tangible world. As the circuit stabilized, the figures began to lose their cohesion, the stability they relied upon to manifest within this atmosphere to solve, their forms stretching thin and fraying like fabric caught in a gale. It was not a violent defeat, but an inevitable consequence of the system reasserting its original parameters. They had pushed the boundaries too far, and now, the weight of the displaced ocean they had carried began to pull them back into the depths, leaving behind only salt and silence. The cost of the stabilization shuddered through WYRMSCALE, a searing heat that traveled from the rod through her arms. Her skin felt raw, as if the static electricity had rewritten her nerve endings. As the last of the figures dissipated into the moisture-heavy air, she collapsed against the metal bench of the bus stop. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrumming of the ocean finally receding from the edges of the city's concrete foundations. The wall of water behind the bus stop did not vanish instantly, but it retreated, turning into a low, mist-filled fog that rolled back toward the horizon. The structural integrity of the district held, though the ground beneath her remained perpetually damp, a permanent reminder of the proximity of the abyss. The figures were gone, their purpose consumed by the very displacement they had championed. WYRMSCALE watched the light return to the sky, realizing that the world would never be dry again. She stood up, her movements stiff and measured. Her first task was to dismantle the makeshift bridge she had created, unscrewing the copper connections with numb fingers. The metal was cold, smelling of ozone and ancient silt. She did not look toward the horizon where the sea lingered. Instead, she focused on the specific, mundane geometry of the bolts. Each turn of the wrench was a deliberate act of reclamation, a small, quiet effort to restore the order that had been so briefly suspended. The bus stop was empty, save for the faint imprint of where the figures had stood, a discoloration in the pavement that refused to wash away. WYRMSCALE left the tools neatly stacked on the bench, knowing she would not need them again in the same way. The landscape looked identical, yet the horizon remained irrevocably changed, a jagged line where the sky met the salt-heavy air. Something had been lost in the exchange. The certainty of the ground beneath her feet was gone forever. WYRMSCALE placed her hand against the cooling brickwork of the archive wall, feeling the tremor of a distant tremor shift beneath the asphalt. Beside her, Elias did not speak, his attention fixed on the tower vanishing into clouds over the parking lot. The structure seemed to breathe, its summit lost to the heavy, gray vapor that had replaced the atmosphere of old. They shared a thermos of tepid tea, the silence between them defined not by trauma, but by the quiet necessity of standing together. The clock on the dashboard of the rusted truck flickered, stuck perpetually at 4 in the morning. WYRMSCALE pulled her scarf tighter as the wind carried the scent of brine and ozone across the empty lot. The tower stretched upward, a singular monolith dissolving into the low-hanging cloud bank, its base rooted in the cracks of the earth. She began the daily survey, counting the fissures into concrete, noting how the ground had shifted once more during the night, demanding constant, wearying adaptation. She found the final ledger buried under a layer of calcified silt near the loading dock. WYRMSCALE opened the water-damaged pages, finding the names of those who had once managed the grid, now illegible under the crystalline growth of sea salt. The tower above continued its slow, silent ascent into the ceiling of the world, indifferent to the records left below. She closed the book, leaving it on the damp pavement, an artifact of a period that had ended before she could fully comprehend its weight. The parking lot was no longer a place of transit, but a site of observation. WYRMSCALE watched a single bird circle the base of the tower, its flight path erratic against the static height of the structure. The clouds did not part, and the tower did not descend, yet the world felt narrower, pressurized by the sheer verticality of the unknown. She stood at the edge of the shadow, observing how the light pooled in the hollows of the ground, marking the passage of time without a sun. The horizon had retreated, leaving only the tower as a point of reference in a landscape that refused to settle. WYRMSCALE turned away from the expanse, her boots crunching on the salt-crusted gravel. There was no grand conclusion to the movement of the earth, only the rhythm of the next step taken on shifting soil. The tower lingered, a pillar of quietude anchoring the sky, while she walked toward the shelter, the taste of salt still lingering on her lips, familiar and entirely permanent.